Although today's topic is all about sound, the only ones that you're going to hear today are mine. Otherwise, we'd have to take a lunch break. I do have lots of pictures and graphics, though. Today we're going to look back at the first half century of AM radio in central New York. Now, names and programs that you're going to hear are representative, not all-inclusive, because the national networks shaped the local sound in the first 30 of those years. We're going to cover them as well. I took an active part in more than 40 of those years, both as a listener and as a broadcaster. So you'll also hear how I interacted with all of that. That's the boring part. The earliest broadcasters were amateur radio operators, or hams as they are still called, first using telegraph keys and Sam Morse's code, but no miles of wires on poles, in what Marconi called wireless telegraphy. So many of them soon were starting to use microphones, inspired by that gizmo invented by Alex Bell, or was it Don Amici? I can never remember. In what, for obvious reasons, was labeled wireless telephony. This airing of human voices instead of dots and dashes forever changed the way we communicate, get news, and how we are entertained. Now, one prominent Syracuse ham was Sam Woodworth, who lived at 271 Genesee Park Drive on the city's southeast side. Now, Sam's 70-foot high backyard radio tower was only 500 feet or so from my folks' front yard on Didymus Street, a nearness which I am sure first got me interested in radio. An equally active ham was Casanovian Clive Meredith, and these two will play major roles in early Syracuse radio. Now, the first known Central New York program, which involved live talent, aired September 15, 1922, from Meredith's home. It was a harp concert by fellow Casanovian Melville Clark, Jr., who ran a popular music store next to Keith's Orpheum Vaudeville Theater on South Salina Street in the city, and whose father's fortune came from Story and Clark pianos. Now, before April 1923, the nation's 600 licensed stations could use any AM frequency they wanted to. But things got so chaotic that the Department of Commerce, that's the Federal Department of Commerce, assigned frequencies to these 5 local operators. Their early programs were spontaneous. A minister, a politician, a performer, sometimes accompanied by a proud parent, showed up asking for airtime, which they invariably got. Now, early on, you heard them through a cat's whisker tuner, in which a thin wire, that's the whisker, passes across a piece of galena crystal. Now, that's the kind that comes from the ground, not from your china cabinet. You heard it through earphones. Now, this happens to be a commercial version, but many hams built their own. They operated without any power source. By 1924, the cat's whisker was rapidly giving way to electrically powered receivers, which were packed with tubes and other stuff. You know, often with a separate loudspeaker that looked like a megaphone. So now, more than one person in the same room could hear a program. Also in 1924, Sam Woodworth, in need of help, hired 3 employees, including 22-year-old engineer Charles Phillips, and 52 years later, Charlie retired as WFBL's affable vice president and general manager. Sam also signed up 2 young announcers, Ernest Chappell and William Lundigan. By June of 24, the 2 business licensed local stations that we saw were gone, and the 3 individual licensees left had increased their power to 100 watts. Wow. In November 1924, Woodworth's call letters became WFBL, which Sam later claimed stood for First Broadcast License. In fairness to Sam, that's probably true if you're talking only about Syracuse radio, because Sam was in Onondaga County while Clive was in Madison County. Also, Carl Woese called it quits in late '24, going on to head a well-known Syracuse engineering design firm. So now, only Clive and Sam are left, and it stayed that way for over 15 years. In 1925, when WFBL again changed frequency to 1190, air times for both stations were still minimal, as this sample shows. It's also apparent that 1923's spontaneity had been replaced by a regular schedule, albeit somewhat limited. One of WFBL's first 2 announcers, a graduate of North High named Ernie Chappell, also wrote a Syracuse Herald radio column called Riding the Waves with Chap. Now here's just a brief glimpse of Chappell's busy life in radio back then. Sure. This is he was pretty active then. This is 22-year-old Ernie in a Herald story about FBL's new Western Electric condenser microphone. He made local radio history with it, doing play-by-play for the very first time. It was the Syracuse-Vermont football game on Saturday, October 3rd, 1925. The following Tuesday, Ernie, banjoist Howdy Rich, and Tipperary Hill tenor pianist Jackie Shannon were heard from the Hunter Tuppen department store at Salina and East Fayette Streets. The building still stands there. The next day, October 7, saw another of Ernie's firsts, recreating the 1925 Washington-Pittsburgh World Series using Associated Press inning-by-inning reports, which were bicycled to him from the Herald. I guess one could say that Syracuse radio began in earnest with Ernest. Oh boy. In the early 30s, Chappell also moved to New York's broadcast world, but he didn't later enter the priesthood, which Jackie Shannon did. Jackie Shannon returned in the 30s. He went down to New York and was on CBS and very popular. But in the 50s, he was back in Syracuse at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception downtown as Monsignor John Shannon. That brings us up to 1926, the first really big year for radio in Syracuse. First, WFBL moved to the Onondaga Hotel's 11th floor, putting 2 towers on the roof, which stayed there for 12 years. Their studios remained there until after World War II, with their announcers just loving to poetically say, WFBL in the Onondaga Hotel, Syracuse. They loved that. And another big 1936 event came in late June when Clive Meredith realized that Cazenovia wasn't as big as Syracuse. And WMAC moved to the big city, where it became WSYR within that year. You know, I've long suspected the MAC in Clive's call letters stood for Madison County, but I can't confirm that. On November 15th, 1926, the National Broadcasting Company, which was owned by Radio Corporation of America, began as a 24-station chain. Unfortunately, the closest links were in Schenectady and Buffalo. The linkage was made using AT&T cables. The term network, by the way, wasn't actually used until 1930. Oh yes. I skipped over another 1926 Syracuse event, which also would have an effect for better or worse, on local radio. A chubby, but you must admit, huggable lad was born March 2nd to a Syracuse couple. Recently retired 54-year-old career Army captain and Mrs. John L. Stockdale, Jr. Because the captain was born in Alabama just after the Civil War, they named him Robert Lee, y'all. And believe me, that's true. They already had 3 grown kids, Elizabeth, who was 20, Margaret, 18, and John III, who was 15, and they were all Army brats. Getting back to the serious part, the Columbia Broadcasting System, created by a popular recording company to broadcast the New York Philharmonic and other classical orchestras, premiered at 3 p.m. on Sunday, September 18, 1927. But within 8 weeks, the record company had backed out, and it became simply the Columbia Broadcasting System. Under the leadership of the La Paulina cigar heir, William S. Paley, who hailed from Philadelphia. WFBL, which had again changed frequencies to 1160, was one of the original stations. However, Howard Barlow's 22-piece symphony orchestra and some Metropolitan Opera members performed The King's Henchman. And somehow, I don't recall hearing it. But then Dad hadn't yet sprung for a radio, and that's possibly the reason. Plus the fact I was only 1 year old, or 2 years old. By mid-1928, WSYR had established its studio and transmitter on the 11th floor of the 4-year-old Hotel Syracuse, and also put their tower on the roof. SYR had no national chain, but it did use a telegraph wire to share programs with WIBX in Utica. Well, it was 1930, and I was 4 when Dad made the big move and bought a Philco table model radio. My parents later said that I stared at the box for hours, convinced that it contained little people. Dad, however, said that what I heard were full-sized people who were somewhere else, their voices sailing through the air from towers like Sam's over on Genesee Park Drive. Well, from then on, you can bet I was determined to find out how in the world they did that. I had already figured out that the sounds that were coming from our wind-up Victrola began on that record, spinning around and with a needle in its grooves. But there wasn't anything moving on that Philco. Okay, here's a side-by-side look at the mid-1930 programs that were tuned in on that new Philco by my folks. Note that WSYR already has its musical clock up there at 8:30, but WFBL hasn't started its timekeeper show, and it wouldn't until the late 30s. As you can also see, WSYR signed off twice that afternoon. Those 3 hours on the WSYR frequency being filled by station WSYU. Now, WSYU was staffed by students at the new Syracuse University School of Broadcasting. One of the very first in the nation, it was in the basement of the library, with studios under those imposing front steps. The fact that Syracuse University already had a school to teach broadcasting shows how rapidly the new medium had grown in 1 decade. Scribble and Sing was a program heard on WSYR in 1930. It featured Central High students Chester Babcock and Ralph Harris, asking listeners to mail in suggestions for song subjects, which Babcock would then compose and Harris would sing on the air. One day, Babcock told Harris that he wanted a zingier name to use on the air. Harris, who was looking out the WSYR hotel windows, repeated what he saw on a nearby billboard, which was pitching a brand of men's shirts, tossing in the first name of his cousin for good measure. And that's how Jimmy Van Heusen came into being. When he got to Hollywood, Jimmy became very close friends with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. And they even used Chester Babcock as Bob Hope's character in the Paramount Pictures Road 2 movie series, which also featured Dorothy Lamour.
Yes.
I can't remember who the guys were, but I do remember Dorothy Lamour. Also by 1930, ex-vaudevillian Wee Willie had moved to Seeley Road, which is a block or two east of our home in the Salt Springs area. Willie's 9-year-old son Albert sang with him regularly on WSYR. And soon he told his dad that he wanted to start using his middle name instead of Albert. And that's why in 1933, as Gordon McCrae, he moved from Charles Andrews School to Nottingham Junior and Senior High, graduating in 1939. He was often heard on WFBL's Miniature Minstrels, which aired from an auditorium at E.W. Edwards' department store. The MC and producer of that show was announcer Bill Lundigan, another native Syracusan, who would spend 13 years at WFBL, leaving for Hollywood in 1937. Bill portrayed a piano player in the 1947 film The Fabulous Dorseys, incidentally. By 1931, WSYR was at the top of the dial at 570 using 250 watts. WFBL with 1,000 watts had moved from 1160 to 1360, but would change again to 1390 10 years later. And also that year, WSYR moved its transmitter to Syracuse University's Archbold Gym and put a new tower on Mount Olympus in an attempt to improve its coverage. But their studios remained in the Hotel Syracuse, at least for a little while. You see, by 1932, the Great Depression had really put the squeeze on both local station owners. Early that year, Cleveland, New York brothers Oscar and Robert Sewell, whose parents had amassed a fortune with a Syracuse-made product called None Such Mincemeat. And they bought WFBL from Sam Woodworth. Then, in November 1932, Clive Meredith sold WSYR to a local father and son team, Mark S. and Colonel Harry C. Wilder. Meredith returned to Cazenovia, but Woodworth and Phillips stayed on at FBL, both remaining there for several decades more. The Wilders soon moved WSYR around the corner to the third floor of the new Starrett Syracuse building on Harrison Street, and they joined NBC's Blue Network. As you can see, the new studios even had an organ. Radio became the prime supplier of free in-home entertainment, creating a lot of new radio stars nationally over the next decade. A period which hosted, incidentally, many of radio's most shining moments. Early CBS headliners, from left to right, included Bing Crosby, Tony Wands, who recited prose and poetry, singers Vera Van and James Melton, the singing team of Frank Crummett and Juliet Sanderson, singer, later film and TV detective Dick Powell, singer Gertrude Neeson, and newsman Edwin C. Hill. Two more singers, Jane Froman and Morton Downey, plus Merton Marge, the precursors to the soap opera, and the comedy couple George Burns and Gracie Allen. 1930s newsmen on both networks also included Lowell Thomas, H.V. Keltonborn, and Boke Carter. In addition, there were the gossip spreaders, Walter Winchell, Hedda Hopper, and Luella Parsons. NBC offered music by Rudy Valley, Russ Colombo, Frank Munn, Jessica Dragonette, Kate Smith, and the Boswell sisters. Other popular daily shows during the 30s were Amos and Andy, Easy Aces, Lum and Abner, and the Goldbergs. Now, my favorites among the kids' shows were Little Orphan Annie with her Secret Society decoder ring, which was later revived by Ralphie in A Christmas Story, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, and Bobby Benson and the H-Barrel Rangers. We also followed Skippy, Tom Mix, and that vine-swinging yodeler Tarzan. But probably the most popular kids' show of the 30s was Let's Pretend, an outstanding children's radio theater which was heard on CBS on Saturday mornings. And who can forget mystery and adventure shows like Buck Rogers and the 25th Century, The Lone Ranger with his faithful companion Tonto, The Green Hornet, and The Shadow, who knew what evil lurked in the hearts of men. The Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet, incidentally, originated at WXYZ in Detroit over the Mutual Broadcasting System, which began in 1934 as a cooperative venture between XYZ and WOR Newark, WGN Chicago, and WLW Cincinnati. The four stations produced and shared the network's programs. They later added a lot more stations. And now for some other popular 1930s variety shows. Major Bow's original Amateur Hour, Ed Wynn, the Texaco Fire Chief, The Jack Benny Show, Allen's Alley starring Fred Allen, The Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy Show, Banjo-Eyed Eddie Cantor, and comedian Joe Penner, a Syracuse boy, by the way, born where the Everson Museum now stands. Then there was The March of Time with Harry Von Zell and later Westbrook Van Voorhees. And I'm sure some of you can recall Van Voorhees' famous oft-repeated line, "Time marches on." And unlike today, there was weekly, in-depth live treatment of things cultural. Some examples: Metropolitan Opera with on NBC Blue and later ABC, the New York Philharmonic on CBS, and NBC's own Symphony Orchestra, which was led by Arturo Toscanini on NBC's Red Network. Now, the mid-30s also saw the birth of a different kind of culture, the quarter-hour soap opera, known then as the Housewife's Salvation. This list names only a few, mostly, of course, sponsored by soap makers Procter & Gamble, Colgate-Palmolive Pete, and Lever Brothers. In 1936, when I was 10, I suffered an attack of polio, which severely affected my right foot. While recuperating, I was also bitten by the radio bug, and I built a fake microphone with erector set parts, using it to introduce songs playing on our Victrola and even reading ads and news stories from the papers. Meanwhile, in the real 1936 radio world, WSYR was up to 1,000 watts, and a new transmitter and 3 towers were installed on Valley Drive, where they remain today. Their Mount Olympus Tower, incidentally, became a flagpole at the Hall of Languages on University Place. 2 years later, WFBL moved its transmitter to Collamer Road, close to what is now Carrier Circle. It built a huge 40-story high antenna that towered above then vacant fields, which today, of course, are full of motels. In the mid-'80s, the feds made them tear down the tower because it blocked an approach to Hancock Field. So they built 3 shorter replacements on Wetzel Road, which are still in use. Now, the mid to late 30s saw the big bands emerge as another network staple. First, in mid-1936, Benny Goodman's Camel Caravan on CBS. In 1937, the Tommy Dorsey Show for Rawleys and Cools on NBC. Both ran through 1940. And by 1938, Artie Shaw was on NBC for Old Goals with Melodies and Madness. In December 1940, Glenn Miller began the Chesterfield Moonlight Serenade a 3-time-a-week quarter hour on CBS. First heard at 10 p.m., it soon was moved to 7:15. And also that year, Jimmy Dorsey began a half hour for 20 grands. And let's not overlook Lucky Strikes. Your Hit Parade aired from 1935 to 1953, featuring 50 named singers over its run, including Frank Sinatra. The show migrated to TV and also inspired radio's top 40 charts. Now, I hope by now I'm not the only one who senses a little trend here. Each of these shows was sponsored by a cigarette maker, yet 30 to 40% of each show's measured audience was 12 to 19 years old. I'm sure the fact that more teens were listening at 7:15 than at 10 p.m. influenced Chesterfield's decision to move Glenn Miller. But the tobacco makers absolutely insisted that they were just targeting those macho adult smokers to get them to switch brands. By the mid-30s, more network radio stars were emerging. In 1937, Bob Hope premiered on NBC for Woodbury Soap, switching to Pepsodent toothpaste a year later. There was also the 1936 debut of Gangbusters, based on the files of the FBI, which had a 21-year run. And how about Big Town, the newspaper yarn show with Claire Trevor and Edward G. Robinson? Bandleader Kay Kaiser did well as the old professor on NBC's College of Musical Knowledge. Orson Welles literally panicked the East Coast with his War of the Worlds episode in 1938. And many listeners loved to shout, "Coming, Mother!" in answer to the call, Henry Aldrich, which every week opened the Aldrich family on NBC. Programming also began to solidify locally in the late 30s. On WFBL's new musical clock from 7 to 9 a.m., host Jim DeLine had a live band called The Gang. Over the years, this group included Myron Levy, Claude Bortel, Jimmy Hogan, Don Anderson, Sox Tifo, and Carl Silfer, among others. And by the 50s, DeLine and his gang were also on WSYR-TV. Other late 30s WFBL voices were sportsman Leo Bali and announcers Jack Curran, Bob Keefe, George Perkins, and Ray Ganter. Now, DeLine's late 30s competition was WSYR's timekeeper Fred Jeske from 7 to 9, a jovial North Sider who also played the piano and sang. His equally popular lead-in was Bob the Deacon Doubleday's Wired Woodshed from 5 to 7 a.m. Now, while Jeske was a piano player, the Deacon used a player piano that he called the Windjammer. He used it in the morning and on his noontime quarter hour. Middays, he would tell how he got to thinking coming down city, and always followed that by a thought that he wanted to pass along. Later, that noontime show was simulcast on TV, player piano and all. And additionally, Doubleday emceed horse shows at the State Fair Coliseum and was one of my professors at SU teaching classes in, of all things, proper announcing. By the late 30s, WSYR had hired a political editor from William Randolph Hearst's Syracuse Journal. E.R. Vadaboncourt, obviously nicknamed Curly, offered very popular noontime commentaries and soon was general manager. Still at WSYR, by that time, was sports director and North Sider Nick Stemler, who began there in 1929, and their women's editor and director Ruth Chilton, who joined the staff way back in 1925 and occasionally played that WSYR organ. There was also Alan Parker, who came from Schenectady's WGY in 1937, and Jan Costley, who hailed from Prescott, Ontario in 1938. I remember yet another WSYR personality, Bill Rothram, on a couple of levels. One was his 30 hours on the air from the deadly Collins Block fire in February 1939, which killed 9 Syracuse firemen, including the father of one of my school friends. And the second was his popular Sunday morning show for kids, which was known as Uncle Bill Reads the Funnies. I wonder where he got that idea from. Rothram later became program director and later still vice president of WSYR. Now, Bill's son Ken followed in his dad's footsteps. He worked in sales for WSEN in the 1960s and later was general manager of WOLF. Speaking of WOLF, April 27, 1940, the first new Syracuse station in 15 years, went on the air headed by T. Sherman Marshall, a former executive at Shell Oil. WOLF's studios were in the Chimes building, their transmitter and tower at Kirkpatrick and Van Rensselaer Streets, where it still stands. It first aired at 1500 on the dial with 100 watts and went to 250 watts in August of that year. But on March 29, 1941, just 12 days before the 4th local AM station went on the air in Syracuse, WOLF switched to 1490 and WFBL moved to 1390 as a part of a massive U.S.-Canadian frequency shift. Now, early on, 2 popular WOLF shows with the younger crowd like me were the after-school campus clambake, which was later called Jukebox Serenade, and the Sandman Serenade, which was a phone-in request show which eventually ran from 10:05 to 2 a.m. I can even remember the phone number, 27211. By then I was 14, had my own bedside radio, and had figured out how to attach headphones to it for late-hour listening. I hid the headphones from my mother, or so I thought. The older WOLF listeners went for half hours of Bing Crosby, Guy Lombardo, the twice-daily polka parties, a daily band concert, plus the WOLF Buckaroos, which were 2 daily 55-minute hillbilly music shows. WOLF's sales whiz, James J. Bud Cooligan, married the boss's daughter, Pat, and later had his own ad agency. But he is best remembered as one of the pioneer jingle creators, producing gems like "Burn Dairy Milk is Mighty Fine," "Dairy Lee, Dairy Lee, Dairy Lee," and hundreds of others, sung and played by Bud, Charlotte Hale, and Norm Misservy. WOLF's sports director was Red Parton, who joined the station while he was still a radio student at SU and would later have his own radio station. Gee, that sounds familiar. Now, on April 14th, 1941, WAGE, the 4th Syracuse radio voice, began with 1,000 watts at 620 on the dial, studios on the 5th floor of the low building, and a transmitter in the pantry of a farmhouse on Old Liverpool Road, near what is now Brzee Chevrolet. The station's vice president and general manager was ex-WSYR commercial manager and agency owner William T. Lane. WAGE's majority stockholder and president was automobile dealer Frank Revore. At first affiliated with Mutual, they got the Blue Network away from WSYR in 1942, leaving SYR with NBC's Red. This was after the feds made RCA break up the 2-network monopoly that they had. WOLF then picked up Mutual. Now, how's that for wartime maneuvers? Initial voices on WAGE included newsman Glenn Williams, who hailed from Sunbury, Pennsylvania, Jan Costley, who moved over from WSYR, plus Larry Lawrence and SU student Gene Crane. And from WSYR came Nick Stemler, whose sports shows were at 6:10 and at 11:10 p.m. Afternoons at 1:30, Bruce Rector did a country music show he called Hillbilly Hotel, portraying hotel owner Uncle Crovney and voicing other male and even female characters. And also from WSYR came Fred Jeske. In addition to a 7 a.m. morning show, piano and all, Fred had an afternoon gig he called Jeske's Inn. Now this was first aired at 2 p.m., later at 12:15, with a group including violinist Carl Silfer and guitar player Johnny Latone. Carl Silfer incidentally married a Baldwinsville girl. In October of 1941, WSYR was able to boost its power to 5,000 watts, which raised them up to WFBL's level. That fall, WAGE aired 2 15-minute shows a week called Your Boy Speaks. They were recorded at Fort McClellan, Alabama, where Bill Lane's nephew Doug Johnson was a National Guardsman in training. Doug chatted with other Central New Yorkers on a disc recorder whose quality, I recall, left much to be desired. On December 7th, 1941, a Sunday, my dad, Brother John, and myself, I was 15 by this time, spent the afternoon and evening glued to the radio. The next morning, December 8th, my 30-year-old brother enlisted in the Army Air Corps, and I was called into the office of Nottingham Principal Harold Kuhn. Yes, I had been summoned there several times before, but this time it was for a good reason. The school had no sound equipment, and Mr. Kuhn knew that I could get some quickly, since for 2 years Don Menapace and I had been operating Century Sound Service, doing disc jockey record dances at schools, including our own. I later learned that ours was the pioneer, one of the pioneer local rent-a-DJ setups in Central New York. Ah yes, one more step on the road to a career in radio. Mr. Kuhn wondered, could I set up some equipment so that we could hear President Roosevelt's address to Congress at 12:30? Could I? I flew home, got some gear from neighbor Paul Abert, who was our equipment source, and had it operating by noon. Now, World War II, of course, caused major staff changes at the 4 Syracuse stations. WSYR's junior announcers Arnie Schoen, Elliot Gove, and Ed Jones signed up together, at first sending reports back to Syracuse from their training camp at Niagara Falls. Soon, WAGE's Gene Crane and Larry Lawrence were service-bound, and at WOLF, Charlie Shaw and Red Parton enlisted. Some stations began using women as control room operators and staff announcers, jobs which were once assigned to males. At WAGE, Wynn Parrish conducted first a women's program called Pep-Ups, 2, News Detective, a phone-in current events quiz show that she did with Bruce Rector, and 3, handled the station breaks from 9 to noon. And that was a very unusual thing to hear in the early 1940s, was a woman doing station breaks. And there were 2 female control room operators. Jane Curtin, who later married post-war morning man Dean Harris, and Amy Paribus, who as Amy Nelson replaced Wynn on the air after the war. I also knew a control room operator at WOLF named Faye Santello, who continued there post-war as commercial production coordinator and record librarian. The overseas network newsmen got big audiences, of course. We at home were following the good and bad news from the war fronts. Locally, WAGE added a unique service for Lowe's State Theater patrons. Glenn Williams and other station announcers would read the latest war news headlines live from the newsroom, following each showing of the MGM newsreel. And at the same time, that personality's picture would be shown on the screen. Weekdays, weekday mornings, WAGE featured the Don McNeil Breakfast Club from Chicago at 9 a.m. and Breakfast in Hollywood at 11. Well, by 1944, I had reached the age of 18, but that polio attack when I was 10 left me service ineligible. And so in September, I entered Syracuse University, majoring in broadcasting. I was there when a temporary 6 to midnight wartime job developed at WAGE. I auditioned and got it, and started December 7, 1944, as I recall. A snow emergency that day had the DPW asking for volunteers to shovel downtown crosswalks and clear fire hydrants, leading to my first blooper on my very first night on the job. During a 30-second break between ABC shows, I solemnly announced, "There is an urgent need for show snufflers downtown." Luckily, I kept my cool and finished the break without any more goofs. On April 12, 1945, I got to work from classes on the Hill at about 5:40 p.m. First automatically checking the AP news machine. A 4-bell signal rang almost immediately. That indicates a flash bulletin. Ah, the war is over in Europe, flashed through my mind. But instead it began to spell out the words, President Roosevelt dead. I was also on duty the evening of August 14, 1945, when the war really did end. Several of us were soon talking to folks outside both downtown hotels, plus Keith's and Lowe's theaters, telling what was happening and often switching back to ABC's national coverage. The Associated Press flash that WAGE received early that evening was autographed by all of the air staff and offered free to listeners. As I recall, more than 12,000 copies were mailed out. Now, with World War II over, that was a short war, wasn't it? A lot of former employees soon returned. However, I must have made a favorable impression on the bosses because I was kept on, even though the job had been temporary. My on-air duties, however, were greatly reduced. Soon I was researching, writing, and producing shows, which I actually found I enjoyed more. The Syracuse radio picture again changed post-war. In 1948, WAGE's power was increased to 5,000 watts a day and 1,000 at night, and a new transmitter building was built, finally moving our engineers out of that farmhouse pantry. Today, that farmhouse is home to a hobby shop. 30 years later, the transmitter building became WHEN 620's studios. Now, one post-war show that I worked on was a Saturday morning story hour featuring high school students. That beanpole second from the right is me, getting ready to create a closing door sound. The cuer is Larry Lawrence, who along with program director Gordon Alderman had just returned from service. There was a 3-year musicians recording strike during the war, which kind of put the end to the big band supremacy, and the young fans turned to the vocalists. There were now quarter-hour shows with Perry Como, Joe Stafford, Dick Haymes, Dinah Shore, the Andrews Sisters, and many more. And surprise, surprise, many of them were sponsored by cigarette makers. Now on September 1, 1945, Doug Johnson, by then a rehabilitated Purple Heart veteran, returned to Syracuse to become WAGE's news editor. He was accompanied by his bride Geraldine, who had cared for him as an Army nurse. Doug was the oldest son of Herbert Johnson, who was a Syracuse Herald editor, and in the 30s had lived near me on that block-long Didymus Street. And so amazingly had two WAGE control room operators, Rudy Heichel and Howie Eilberg. I guess we should have renamed the street Radio Row or something like that. Now, Doug's local news was the first sign of a new post-war direction for local radio stations. That is, daily, multi-story coverage of local happenings that hadn't happened before. They would cover a big fire or something like that, but that was all. They wouldn't have in-depth, not in-depth, but multi-stories in their local newscast. And WAGE also added an off-the-air news writer named Morgan Redmore. Months later, the local news trend continued with the move to WSYR by Fred Hillegas. He was a Post-Standard reporter and did noon and 6 p.m. newscasts. Not to be outdone, WFBL added local news by Ray Owens, whose real last name was Kreis, by the way. Ray was also a musician, had composed a Jimmy Dorsey hit called Long John Silver. About a year and a half after the war's end, the WFBL's offices and studios moved to two buildings with a common facade on South Warren across from Schraff's restaurant. And WOLF moved into FBL's vacated hotel studios. The reason for the move was because much of the Chimes building was being taken over for government offices in December 1948. But they only stayed there for less than 4 years while their studios were being built at their transmitter site. A new post-war WFBL announcer was Solvay native Ron Curtis, who soon became chief announcer at WFBL. In the early 50s was a DJ at WAGE, which became WHEN 620. He later became WHEN-TV's Atlantic Refining weatherman, who you see here, and soon was their longtime, very popular news anchor. And from Chicago to WSYR came savvy, entertainment-oriented Ed Murphy, who was soon doing nighttime music and interview shows from the Downtown Travel Room, the Rainbow Lounge, the Brown Jug, and Andre's TikTok Club. Ed also became the morning timekeeper and still later host of WSYR-TV's Hollywood Matinee. As time went by, his graying hair earned him the title the Silver Fox. It was in early 1946 that we learned that a fifth AM radio station was coming when the FCC authorized Arthur Kyle Jr. to operate WNDR at 1260 with 5,000 watts. The Wonder Station began in August from a transmitter site on Andrews Road just south of DeWitt, with studios in the Wilson Building on South Salina Street. There was an immediate upheaval at WAGE, with Fred Jeske and Glenn Williams going to NDR. Jeske was replaced by Dean Harris, a radio personality from Ithaca, while New York City newspaperman Joe Comiskey succeeded Williams. Other early NDR air names were disc jockeys Bob Ale, Bill Quinn, and Jim Cosgrove, local newsman Dan Leonard, and sports reporters Jerry Hoffman and Jim McKechnie. Another popular NDR feature was live country music by Wayne Schramm and his Ozark Mountain Boys from De Ruyter. In response, WAGE added its own live country music band, Bob Mason and the Western Swingbillies, featuring Duke Dixon and Lloyd Cornell. They had come from WWVA in Wheeling, West Virginia. Meanwhile, over at WOLF, the post-war air staff now included returnees Charlie Shaw and Red Parton, plus Denny Bracken. And there was even Dick Clay, a fellow SU broadcasting student whose dad ran a Utica radio station and whose real last name was Clark. Yes, the same Dick Clark, who you remember very well as running the American Bandstand, and still does New Year's Eve shows from Times Square. Yes, and after graduating from SU, Dick went to WFIL-TV in Philadelphia, where he soon created the Bandstand. But he got his start at WOLF. Another late 40s assignment for me was announcing music from the Hotel Syracuse. Thursday nights at 8:30, it was the current Persian Terrace Band. Sometimes there was an ABC feed, usually after midnight. And then on Saturday nights at 6:15 came 15 minutes of whatever small group was in the Rainbow Lounge, like the Three Sons, pianist Jan August, or Dardanelle and her trio. By 1948, I was also researching and producing 3 half-hour radio shows a week from South Salina movie houses, designed to give the theaters and WAGE some audience-drawing events to compete with that emerging demon called television. From the Empire, the Sunday afternoon Bieber Isaac's Talent Time show with Carl Silfer's band and local talent. A Monday night quiz show at Lowe's State with Larry Lawrence called Win with Westinghouse. And Step Up, another quiz show at Keith's, hosted by Bruce Rector on Wednesdays. Incidentally, Amy Nelson was our radio version of TV's Betty Furness, doing Westinghouse commercials from Lowe's State on that show. Open range door and all, incidentally. The WAGE audience couldn't see her, but the Lowe's audience certainly could. As all this was going on, 2 major competitors blossomed to forever change what was heard on AM here, and for that matter across the nation. First, a quick look at early Syracuse TV. December 1, 1948, Better Homes and Gardens Meredith Publishing Company starts WHEN TV on Channel 8. Melville Clark plays the same harp music he did in 1922 for Clive Meredith. Incidentally, there's no relationship between Clive Meredith and Meredith Publishing Company that I can determine. February 15, 1950, WSYR-TV begins on Channel 5 with announcing and control rooms 4 floors above their AM/FM setup and bigger studios in a large garage next door on Harrison Place. September 9, 1962. Yes, it is 12 years later. WNYS Channel 9 goes on the air from Shoppingtown under the leadership of W.R.G. Baker, late of General Electric in Schenectady. But the FCC has to change the channel numbers of WSYR and WHEN as well as WHAM in Rochester to do it. Now, the underlying cause for the big 1962 shuffle was really WAGE, which back in 1947 had received authority to build the 3rd Syracuse TV station on Channel 10. For reasons that were pretty hard to fathom at the time, Bill Lane convinced himself in the winter of 1948 that WAGE-TV would fail. So he went to visit Frank Revore, who was wintering in Florida, and got him to turn the channel back to the FCC. Then, in a 1-2 blow, FM radio concurrently entered the medium mix. By 1947, every local AM owner was on the air or had the authority to do so in the new 88 to 108 megahertz FM band. Not all of them, however, operated for any significant period of time. WFBL, WOLF, and WNDR shared an antenna farm near Pompey, where Channel 9 now operates. WSYR had theirs on Sentinel Heights near Nedrow, soon using the same spot for TV. But WAGE-FM's studio and transmitter control room were set up in vacant offices next to our main studios, and a tower was put on the roof of the Low building. While others mostly duplicated their AM programs, WAGE played classical and background music from 3 to 9, 7 days a week, except for simulcasting the 6 p.m. half-hour news block Monday through Friday. Now, because he had the airtime available, Nick Stemler, who was our sportscaster, did the 3 to 6 shift on FM, while I covered 6:30 to 9 p.m. To hear Nick try to handle those composers' names and composition titles was worth the price of a new FM set. Now, while WAGE had its sports guy doing classical music, WSYR-FM was carrying exclusive play-by-play coverage of Danny Biazone's brand new Syracuse Nationals NBA basketball team from the Jefferson Street Armory. In 1949, the Nats would switch to the State Fair Coliseum, and coverage would soon change to WNDR, with Jim McKechnie calling the plays. Now, I guess all of this was the last straw for Nick Stemler. He went south and was replaced as sports director by Bob Hendrickson, who was just out of the Air Force at Hancock Field. In 1948, WSYR AM and FM was bought by Newhouse Broadcasting Corporation, part of the media giant which by that time owned both Syracuse newspapers. But of course, even more attractive was the Wilders' permit for a new TV station, believe me. Later, Newhouse would also enter the cable TV field as New Channels Corporation. In the late 40s, WSYR hired an announcer who had been a school chum of mine in the mid-30s and had even joined me back then in playing radio. Don Dower would spend nearly 30 years with WSYR, becoming the Deacon's replacement in the mid-60s. Well, through 1949 and 1950, I watched gloomily while the TV mangled radio as I knew it. Having been promised a production role in the WAGE TV setup, I sadly watched my prospects blow away. Doug Johnson, who was equally dissatisfied and disappointed at the time with the TV decision, left to form a public relations and advertising agency in late 1948. And in April 1951, I joined Doug's agency and started along with that new PR career for myself. This despite having on February 25th, 1950, married my wife Shirley, who by 1951 was expecting our first child. You can see how mad I was. Now, I'm sure there was no connection, but within 6 months of my leaving WAGE, Bill Lane went to Atlanta to open a new TV station, taking Bob Hendrickson with him. Then Doug Johnson moved into Lane's WAGE spot. But inside 3 years, Frank Revore saw WAGE's future as questionable and sold it to Meredith Publishing, which then changed it to WHEN Radio. But before that happened, however, Doug returned to the agency in 1953. It was a real shuffle. This shows all 135 pounds of me that year assembling media data for a major Doug Johnson client, the New York State Fair. We had just moved to the old FBL OLF studios in the Onondaga Hotel where this picture was shot. Let me tell you, it was a real nostalgia trip for me to be working where radio had really blossomed in Syracuse. The extra 50 pounds you now see before you, incidentally, were added about a decade and a half later when tobacco and I parted company. From the 20s to the early 50s, Syracuse's AM broadcasters had been in show business. All things to all people. They offered everything musical from hillbilly to classical. Their drama ranged from soap operas to mysteries. Their variety from comedy to musicals. There were quiz shows and talent shows and play-by-play sports like baseball and basketball, golf and football, and even boxing. Well, golly, that sounds a lot like TV and cable today. Well, of course, Gomer, that's just what happened. TV knocked out radio by taking over its primary program. The major loss from all this was the one thing which made radio so intriguing: its challenge to your imagination. Every 30s and 40s radio listener had his or her own image of what Fibber McGee's closet looked like, or for that matter, how much money was in Jack Benny's basement vault. We each knew in our own minds exactly how the Green Hornet or the Lone Ranger dealt with the bad guys. Today's generations aren't challenged. Someone else's concept is visually fed to them. A tragic loss indeed, for an active imagination is the first step toward originality and creativity. AM radio became a one-on-one, mostly musical medium, with the disc jockey rising to the rank of supreme potentate. WOLF had given the first hint by playing records all day, and as network shows evaporated, the other stations quickly followed Sherm Marshall's lead. All Syracuse AMers except WSYR turned toward one version or another of the top 40 format, playing everything from rock to doo-wop, pop vocals to Motown. Soon these stations were issuing weekly charts, so vital to record sales that labels began influencing what the jocks played, which led to federal payoff scandal trials in 1959, though none of them were involving local people. By 1955, the radio networks were pale reflections of their past, with the sole exception of NBC's new Monitor, a magazine of the air mix of news, sports, comedy, variety, live music, celebrity interviews, and other short segments. It aired from 8 a.m. on Saturdays to midnight on Sundays and lasted an amazing 20 years. Now, from the mid-20s through the early 50s, a minimum of 3 people were always on duty at local stations: a studio announcer and a studio control room operator, plus a first-class licensed transmitter engineer. Now, while some stations were being forced to abandon costly studios and move to their transmitter sites, equipment became more stable. As a result, first-class licensed engineers were no longer required 24/7. So, announcers were learning how to run control boards and queue up records. These 3 people became one third-class licensed announcer engineer, who by the 70s would be increasingly female. As time went by, even they were often replaced by automation, where syndicated musical or talk programs, some live, some taped, are fed by satellite to equipment at the transmitter studio, which in turn, acting on a subliminal tone cue from the source, inserts taped local announcements, weather, and so forth. An example which seniors know is The Music of Your Life. And I'm sure that most other local stations are also automated at various times during the day and particularly in the evening. Today, FM, through its superior high-fidelity sound, has effectively taken over the music end. And the AM stations have become mostly all talk, all news, or all sports. In 1956, the Sewells left radio by selling WFBL to First Broadcast Corporation. It was a move signaling big changes in absentee ownership to come. Nevertheless, I was 31 by 1957 and had begun market studies to find a smaller New York State town where a local radio station might make it. I looked at spots like Newark, Seneca Falls, and Cooperstown, among others, finally settling on one where the sense of community was greater than any other I had seen. I got together with a longtime friend, Don Menapace, by then active in the family's real estate business, and contacted Ohio radio man Jim Lowry, and we applied to the FCC for a license here in Baldwinsville. Our company, Century Radio Corporation, was granted a 250-watt daytime AM station at 1050 on the dial, beating out competing applicants in Auburn and Rome. Building began in the late fall of 1958, and we went on the air February 25, 1959 as WSEN. Yes, WSEN's golden anniversary is only 2 years away. We were the first new AM station locally in 13 years, and the first daytime-only station. Our concept, which was labeled the Sentinel, the suburban radio service, was planned to be the broadcast equivalent of the brown newspapers, serving the northern and western suburbs. Glenn Williams joined us from WNDR as our newsman, staying until May 1962. Another early news voice was Ed Case, who came over from WFBL. Now, what Jim Lowry liked best was play-by-play sports, and from the outset did a lot of local school events. He's shown here with Dick Pirong, our first chief engineer, who still lives in Beeville. Dick later became a DJ at WFBL. Our initial team of disc jockeys included Tommy Kay, Orem Duck, and Bob Van Cleek, the last two coming from WOLF. On weekends, we also had a fellow named Hal Miller. That first year, we aired all of our news and sportscasts from a booth in the Pure Foods building at the 1959 New York State Fair. This particular shot shows Jim, DJ Tommy Kay, and me setting up for a busy week. As you can see, I haven't given up smoking yet. In 1960, Tommy did his afternoon show daily also from a storefront studio in Fairmount Fair. In May of 1959, Sherm Marshall sold WOLF to Ellis Erdman of Ithaca, who raised daytime power up to 1,000 watts. The ownership of WOLF would change several more times over the next decade and a half. And believe me, that new guys status that we enjoyed at WSEN unfortunately didn't last for very long. In late 1959, Red Parton and ad agency owner Steve Webb put Syracuse daytimer WPAW on the air at 1540. In the 70s, it became religious station WYRD, and today it's another religious operation, WSIV. In 1960, WNDR's Jim McKechnie started WJMK in North Syracuse at 1220. 6 years later, he sold out and it became WSOQ, whose frequency later changed to 1200. Somewhere in there, they had to move their tower because of the construction of Route 481. And it is now WTLA, the home of the music of your life. On October 1, 1961, WQSR at 1320 kilocycles began behind Duke's Plumbing at 1020 Hiawatha Boulevard near Route 690. Licensed to Salve, it lasted only 5 years and abruptly left the air. By September 1962, it was obvious that we needed to change our course at WSEN. And so, after my recalling those hillbilly and western fans at OLF, AGE, and NDR who hadn't gone anywhere, WSEN switched to what was by then being called country and western music. We became the first country station north of the Mason-Dixon line. A little more than a year later, we had gone from number 12 in the market to number 5 or 6, and in a couple of years we would do even better than that. Our new morning DJs were Early Williams, who later went to Nashville, and Fred Lewis, a country singer and musician who later worked at WSCP in Sandy Creek, Pulaski. Some others were Rick Ryder from WOLF, Bill Orand, and Bob Barnes, who was right out of Baker High. Bob later worked at WOLF and now runs a Florida radio production company. WOSC Fulton's Jack Burgess, who was our new chief engineer, also sold time and did 2 WSEN weekend auto race news shows. Arnie Pugh came to us from Rome, covered some DJ slots and sold time as well. Arnie and Jack, who have both left us, were equally well known for announcing at area stock car tracks. And of course, stock car racing, and that's particularly NASCAR stock car racing, and country music are synonymous. For over a decade, WSEN's country concerts at the War Memorial regularly attracted audiences of from 5 to 10,000, 5 to 6 times a year, to see hundreds of the top country music names. And these that you see are but a very tiny part of the whole list. In 1967, we added 100 feet to our original tower to put full-time WSEN-FM on the air at 92.1 with 3,000 watts. It's now 25,000 watts. This let us be on the air beyond the daylight hours. That was our main aim in doing it. We also increased our AM power from 250 to 1,000 watts, and now it's 2,500 watts. We had to add a second tower, however, to avoid interfering with stations in New York and Toronto. Now, naturally, our country success again brought out the copycats, determined to do away with those Hicks and Beeville. WJMK was first, lasting little more than one rating period. WPAW was next, changing to another format about a year and a half later. And there were a couple more even bigger ones. But actually, WSEN's main late 60s competition wasn't other country stations. Between them, the top 40 sounds at OLF, FBL, and NDR were knocking off 30 to 40% of the total audience. OLF, for example, had Bud Ballou, Dale Dorman, Ed Clancy, Wendy Craig, Hank Greenwald, Dan Leonard, Jim Sims, and Johnny Van. WNDR had Peter Cavanaugh, George Plovakis, Mac and Maud, Raleigh Fowler, Howie Castle, and Dave Laird. You can see we're now in the 60s, obviously. And WSYR at 570 hadn't vanished either. From top to bottom, they had Floyd Ottaway, Carol Johnson, Ed Murphy, Fred Hilligus, Joel Marinas, Elliot Gove, Dick Hoffman, Alan Miller, John Gray, The Deacon, and Bill O'Donnell. Now, as the first 50 years of Syracuse radio came to an end in the early 70s, WSEN was the last resident-owned AM station in the county. For over a decade, well-heeled, out-of-town multi-station owners had been buying local stations, using big money giveaways to hype ratings, and then selling their stations 3 or 5 years later for several times what they paid for them. It was also no secret that the profits from our War Memorial country shows were what helped keep us on the air. Think Smoky Hollow Market versus Wegmans, or Titcomb's Department Store versus Walmart. And you'll see why we sold WSEN to Century Broadcasting of New York City on February 25, 1974, 15 years to the day after first going on the air. It kind of sounds like I'm stuck on that date, doesn't it? After 30 years, I left radio, moving to the American Cancer Society. Jim Lowry stayed on for a while at WSEN, then went to WSGO in Oswego, only recently retiring, though continuing play-by-play. Don Menapace, long retired from real estate, lives in Florida. Well, what is the future of local radio? The younger generations, long the backbone of radio's growth, have turned in vast numbers to the internet, blogs, iPods, cell phones, MTV, VH1, Net TV, music downloads, portable DVDs, satellite radio, and the list grows longer every month, it seems. They are formed into thousands of loose groups worldwide which have little sense of local community. To keep in touch, they don't need a local radio, or for that matter, newspaper or local TV station as a source. Now, whether that's good or bad, only history will tell. I think you'll agree that a lot took place, some good, some bad, in the golden years of Syracuse AM radio. But I will say I am proud to have played a role in that history. I'm also happy that I've been able to apply the things that I learned to the development of yet another communication entity which makes Baldwinsville so unique, PAC-B, Channel 98. Now, are there any questions anyone would like to ask? Yes?
There's a wonderful radio.
Oh yes, yes. I intended to mention that, and I flipped over the page. WBXL at Baker High has been there since the mid-'60s, I believe, somewhere around in there. In fact, when we put the FM station on the air, we had to get a new console which would handle 2 different channels and be able to control both radio stations. And so we gave our original console, which controls microphones and records and everything, to WBXL to get them started. In fact, I think it's still there, but they don't use it anymore because it's got tubes in it, you know, but it's still there. And we also contributed some other items to get them started. You know. And it's amazing that it is still on the air. It's the only one in Onondaga County.
Yes.
There's another one, I'm not sure whether it's still on the air or not, in Central Square there was one too, but I'm not sure whether it's still on the air. But it does give inspiration to high school kids to get them interested in actually getting into radio. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And didn't you mention to me one time that you were in the Hall of Fame at the Nashville?
Yes, yeah, the WSEM, for a long time there was a plaque in the Country Music Hall of Fame in Nashville, which mentioned that WSEM was the first country music station north of the Mason-Dixon line. It was there for about 15 years, I guess. Finally, I guess they get tired of looking at it.
Maybe you should have a 50-year reunion for the WSEN.
Well, I'm trying to, well, it wouldn't be 50 years for the country music, but I am trying to get the present ownership there interested in doing something on the 50 years anniversary. Any other?
Is it still Century? Is it still the same ownership as the ones you sold to?
No, no. The new owners are, the present owners is Buckley Communications. Yeah. Century had it for about 10 years, I guess, and then sold it to Buckley. Which Buckley, incidentally, also runs WFBL.
They share studios now, or not?
From the studios up here,
Right,
yeah.
that's what I thought.
The towers are over on Wetzel Road, but the WFBL now originates from up here.
Yeah.
FBL, they did it by first acquiring the call letters. It was a funny thing. They started out, WFBL was a top 40 operation, and they sold out to a religious group which wanted to change the call letters. And so the Buckley Communication bought the call letters and the rights to the music of your life, which was on WFBL at 1390, transferred it and made the old WSEN at 1050 became WFBL 1050. And then when the religious group wanted to sell, Buckley bought over there and bought the frequency, and actually didn't buy, but got the rights to the frequency. They then transferred WFBL to 1390, and now WSEN AM duplicates WSEN FM. It's the same programming on the two stations. I think they just keep WSEN AM on the air to hold the frequency so somebody else won't use it. It certainly doesn't add much to duplicate on a 2,500 watt AM station what you've got on a 25,000 watt FM station. I think they do it just to do that.
I'm trying to recall a couple of people I thought would be included. Phil Marker.
Yeah, well, Phil was actually after the 60s.
Oh,
People don't
okay,
realize
all
that.
right.
Yeah.
Now I just wondering where he fit in there.
Yeah, Phil.
He didn't.
There were a lot that I had to start backing away from because they really didn't enter the picture until after the 50-year period.
Okay. When are you going to do your sequel? the next victim.
It depends on how long my stamina lasts.
That's marvelous, you've done
Yeah.
this.
Any others? Good, go on. No.
I just wanted to say that I wouldn't worry about the future of radio because the current trend now on the internet is all these kids internationally are starting their own radio shows.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And I just read an article online where they're following the formula of local radio,
Mhm.
and it sounds like WBXL, but you can be listening to Norway. I mean, it just,
Yeah.
radio is not going to die.
Yeah, but that was the point I was making, that with the internet taking over all of that, there will be no need to have a physical transmitter locally that's broadcasting local music anymore.
Well, you can't.
Because that has to sustain itself by selling time, and you can't sell time if your listenership continues to decline way down. They're not able to keep it on the air. The only way it would stay, the only way AM radio will stay on the air is if the government takes it over. That's the only way that over the next decade and a half, you'll see a lot of AM kind of, not in the case, let's say, of SEM, because they can just keep it on the air. And it doesn't cost them that much to keep it on the air, but because they don't have to produce programming for it, specifically different programming. But I'm just worried that over the years that's going to happen. So anyway, would anyone like a copy of that?
Yeah.
Oh,